The sound of the ruler striking the desk was deafening. Jackson Carter. Principal Miller's voice boomed through the room, silencing the small crowd of students gathered in the hallway outside his office. Explain to me why you think it's okay to be late to my school every day. Jackson stood silently, his head bowed. He clutched his worn backpack tightly, his fingers trembling. His shoes, caked in dried mud, were falling apart at the seams. The faintest whimper escaped his lips, but he said nothing. Nothing to say? Very well. Principal Miller browed at the tension slip and scribbled furiously. If you can't respect the rules of this school, we'll spend your evenings here until you learn. Jackson's eyes widened as the principal slammed the slip onto the desk, but instead of the defiance or anger Miller expected, Jackson only nodded, turned, and shuffled toward the door. As he reached for the handle, the principal noticed something odd. Jackson was limping. A pang of unease struck him, but he quickly dismissed it. Discipline was discipline. Hours later, as Principal Miller locked up for the night, he decided to check the security cameras. He wanted to confirm if Jackson had truly been wandering around, wasting time before school. But what he saw shocked him to his core. Jackson, wearing the same tattered shoes and clothes, was seen walking along the deserted road leading to the school. The timestamp read 5:45 a.m., nearly 2 hours before school even opened. Frame after frame showed Jackson trudging onward, battling the cold morning air, his pace slowing as he passed through fields and forests. Principal Miller stared at the screen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Where is he coming from? He muttered to himself. That night, Miller couldn't sleep. He replayed the footage in his mind, trying to piece together why a young boy would endure such a journey. The next day, he resolved to follow Jackson after school, determined to uncover the truth. The day had started like any other at Greenfield Middle School. Students filed into their classrooms, laughter and chatter filling the air. But for Jackson, mornings were anything but ordinary. His alarm clock, a hand-me-down from his grandmother, buzzed at 4:30 a.m. sharp. He rolled out of bed, careful not to wake his younger sister sleeping on the mattress beside him. Their small, run-down house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Jackson pulled on his clothes, the same ones he'd worn all week, and grabbed a slice of stale bread from the kitchen counter. His mother had left for work hours ago, her shift at the diner starting before the sun rose. He kissed his sister on the forehead and slipped out the door. The journey to school was grueling. Jackson walked over 6 miles, cutting through muddy fields and narrow trails to save time. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he pressed on, knowing the importance of reaching school on time. Principal Miller followed Jackson that evening, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. The route Jackson took was anything but straightforward. He navigated dirt paths, crossed streams, and climbed steep inclines, all with the determination of someone far older than his 12 years. Miller's heart sank as he watched the boy struggle. Finally, Jackson arrived at a small, dilapidated house. The roof sagged under its own weight, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. Jackson opened the door and stepped inside. Through the window, Miller saw him embrace a young girl, likely his sister. Why didn't he say anything? Miller whispered, guilt flooding his chest. He drove away, unable to shake the image of the boy's home. The next morning, Principal Miller called Jackson into his office again. The boy looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. Sit down, Jackson, Miller said, his tone softer this time. I, I want to apologize for how I treated you yesterday. Jackson looked up, surprised. It's okay, sir. No, it's not, Miller continued. I didn't understand your situation, but I do now. You walk 6 miles to school every day? Jackson hesitated, then nodded. I have to, sir. I want to learn. I don't want to end up like. He stopped, biting his lip. Like what, Jackson? Miller prompted gently. Like my dad, Jackson said quietly. He left us. Said it was too hard, but I won't give up. I can't. Miller leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the boy's resilience. He knew he had to do something, but what? Jackson, he said finally, I want to help you. But first, I need to know, what can I do to make things better for you? Jackson's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. But just as Miller began to outline a plan, the school secretary burst into the room, her face pale. Principal Miller, she gasped, there's been an accident. Jackson froze. What kind of accident? He asked, his voice trembling. Miller looked at the secretary, fear gripping him. Tell me what happened, he demanded. It's your sister, Jackson, she said. She's at the hospital. You need to go now. Jackson's heart pounded as he bolted from the principal's office. Principal Miller followed close behind, grabbing his car keys and motioning for Jackson to get in his car. The drive to the hospital was a blur for both of them. What happened? Jackson asked desperately, his voice breaking. Is she okay? Is it bad? The secretary's words played over and over in his head. Your sister is at the hospital. He clenched his fists, willing himself not to cry. He couldn't cry. He had to stay strong for her. Principal Miller kept his eyes on the road, but answered softly, I don't know the details, Jackson. We'll find out when we get there. Just hold on, okay? When they arrived at the hospital, Jackson jumped out of the car before it had even come to a full stop. He rushed into the emergency room, his eyes scanning the room frantically. The nurse approached, her expression kind but serious. You must be Jackson, she said, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. Your sister is stable now, but she had a bad fall. She's in recovery. Jackson exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a wave. Can I see her? He asked, barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded. Follow me. Principal Miller stayed back, giving Jackson the space he needed. As he watched the boy disappear down the hallway, Miller's mind raced. The image of Jackson walking miles to school, his tattered shoes barely holding together, and now this, his little sister injured and in the hospital. How much more could one child endure? Jackson entered the hospital room, his steps cautious. There she was, Emily, his 8-year-old sister, lying in the hospital bed, her arm wrapped in a cast. She looked so small and so fragile, her face pale against the white sheets. Emily, Jackson whispered, stepping closer. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, a weak smile spread across her face. Jack, she said, her voice barely audible. What happened? He asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. I was trying to hang up the laundry, she said. The line was too high, and I fell. Jackson swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at him. He should have been there. He should have helped her before school. But he'd been too focused on getting to class on time. It's okay, he said, forcing a smile. You're going to be fine. I promise. Emily looked at him with wide, trusting eyes. You always take care of me, Jack. Jackson nodded, though the weight of her words felt heavier than ever. He had to be strong for her sake. But deep down, he wondered how much longer he could keep this up. When Jackson returned to the waiting room, Principal Miller was still there, sitting stiffly in one of the plastic chairs. He stood as soon as he saw Jackson. How is she? Miller asked. She'll be okay, Jackson said. Thank you for driving me here. Miller nodded, but his expression was troubled. Jackson, he began hesitantly. Where's your mom? Shouldn't she be here? Jackson looked down, his fingers twisting together. She's at work. She doesn't know yet. If she leaves, she'll lose her shift. And we can't afford that. Miller's chest tightened. He'd suspected things were hard for Jackson, but hearing it said out loud made it all the more real. Let me drive you home, Miller said after a moment. We can stop by the diner and let your mom know on the way. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. When they pulled up to Jackson's house, Miller was struck again by the sheer poverty surrounding them. The yard was overgrown, the porch steps sagged under their own weight, and the paint was peeling in long strips. Jackson opened the door and turned to Miller. Thank you, he said simply. Jackson wait, Miller said, stepping out of the car. I need to say something. The boy turned, his eyes weary but attentive. I owe you an apology, Miller began. I misjudged you. I didn't take the time to understand what you're going through. For that, I'm sorry. Jackson blinked, clearly taken aback. It's okay, sir. No, it's not, Miller said firmly. And I don't want to just apologize. I want to help, but I need you to let me. Jackson hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay. The next day at school, Principal Miller called a staff meeting. He laid out Jackson's situation, urging his team to brainstorm ways to help not just him, but other students who might be facing similar challenges. We're not just educators, he said. We're role models, advocates, and sometimes the only support these kids have. We can do better. The teachers agreed, moved by Jackson's story. Idea explodes, setting up a fund for transportation, creating after-school programs, and partnering with local charities to provide supplies for families in need. But just as things seemed to be taking a hopeful turn, the school secretary rushed into the room, panic written all over her face. Principal Miller, she said, her voice trembling, we just got a call. Jackson didn't show up to class today, and no one's answering at his house. Miller froze, his heart sinking. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Principal Miller's hands tightened around the edge of the desk as dread flooded his chest. He had spent the past day planning ways to help Jackson, but now the boy was missing. The teachers in the room exchanged concerned glances, murmuring softly among themselves. "We have to find him," Miller said, standing abruptly. "I'll check his house." "I'll call the police," the secretary offered, already reaching for the phone. "No," Miller said quickly. "Let's not escalate this yet. Jackson might just be delayed or dealing with his sister. Let me check first. If I don't find him in the next hour, we'll call." Miller grabbed his coat and keys and raced to his car. The drive to Jackson's house felt longer than it should have, every red light and stop sign fueling his anxiety. When he arrived, the house looked just as it had the night before, warm, quiet, and eerily still. He knocked on the door. "Jackson." "It's Principal Miller." "Are you home?" Silence. "Emily? Is anyone there?" He called again, his voice growing louder. Still nothing. Unease prickled at the back of his neck. Miller peered through the window, his breath fogging up the glass. The small living room was empty, save for a couple of old chairs and a rickety table. There were no signs of life. Frowning, Miller walked around to the side of the house. A faint noise stopped him in his tracks, muffled sobs coming from the backyard. "Jackson," he called out, quickening his pace. When he rounded the corner, his heart broke at the sight. Jackson was sitting on the ground, his knees pulled to his chest, his face buried in his arms. His shoulders shook as he cried quietly, completely unaware of Miller's presence. "Jackson," Miller said softly, crouching down beside him. The boy flinched, his head snapping up. His tear-streaked face was a mix of fear and despair. "I am sorry," he stammered, wiping at his eyes. "I didn't mean to." "Stop." Miller interrupted gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. What's going on? Why aren't you at school?" Jackson hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Emily's gone," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Miller's stomach churned. "Gone? What do you mean?" They took her," Jackson said, fresh tears spilling over. "Child Services. They came this morning while I was getting ready for school. They said we can't stay here alone anymore." Miller's heart sank. He knew this was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed was gut-wrenching. "And your mom?" he asked. "She's at work," Jackson said. "She doesn't even know yet. They wouldn't let me call her." Miller exhaled deeply, struggling to process everything. He placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Jackson. We'll figure this out. I promise." "But what if they don't let her come back?" Jackson whispered. "What if I lose her?" The fear in the boy's voice was palpable, and Miller felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't let Jackson face this alone. After ensuring Jackson had something to eat and drink, Miller took him to the diner where his mother worked. The moment she saw them walk through the door, her face went pale. "Jackson, Principal Miller? What are you doing here?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "We need to talk," Miller said, guiding her to a quiet corner of the restaurant. He explained what had happened, keeping his tone calm but firm. Jackson's mother listened, her face crumbling with each word. "They can't just take her," she said, her voice trembling. "She's all we have." "They can't, and they did," Miller said gently. "But this doesn't have to be the end. We can fight this. We can prove you're able to care for both of them." Her eyes filled with tears. "How?" "I'm already working 2 jobs. I'm doing everything I can." Miller nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Let me help. We'll find resources, legal aid, whatever it takes. But first, we need to contact Child Services and get more information." That evening, Jackson sat quietly at the kitchen table while his mother spoke to a caseworker on the phone. The room felt heavy with tension, the uncertainty of the situation looming over them like a storm cloud. When she finally hung up, her hands were shaking. "They're keeping Emily in temporary care until they can assess our living situation," she said. "They'll let us see her, but they don't know when she can come home." Jackson's face crumpled and he ran to his room. Miller followed him, finding the boy sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. "It's not fair," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was trying so hard. I thought if I just kept going, everything would be okay. But it's not." Miller sat down beside him. "It's okay to feel that way, Jackson. You've been carrying so much on your own. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here. We're going to get through this together." Jackson looked at him, his eyes full of both hope and doubt. Promise? I promise, Miller said firmly. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Miller worked tirelessly, coordinating with local charities, legal advocates, and community members willing to help. Slowly but surely, a plan began to take shape. But just as progress seemed within reach, a sudden knock at the door shattered the fragile sense of hope. Jackson's mother opened it to find two uniformed police officers standing on the porch. Ma'am, one of them said gravely, "We need to speak with you about an incident involving your employer." Her face went pale. "What kind of incident?" The officer hesitated. "Your manager has accused you of theft. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." Jackson, who had been sitting in the living room, jumped to his feet. "No, she didn't do anything." Miller stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Officer, there must be a mistake. She's been working tirelessly to provide for her family. There's no way." "I'm sorry, sir," the officer said, cutting him off. "We have to follow protocol." As Jackson watched his mother being led away in handcuffs, his world shattered all over again. Jackson stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock as the police car drove away. His mother's tear-streaked face was burned into his memory. Principal Miller placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but Jackson shrugged it off and ran inside. "She didn't do it," Jackson shouted, his voice cracking with anger and despair. "She wouldn't steal. She worked so hard every single day. Why won't anyone believe us?" Miller followed him, his heart breaking for the boy. "Jackson, listen to me. I believe you," he said firmly. "But we need to stay calm. If we let our emotions take over, it'll only make things harder." Jackson sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "Why does this keep happening to us? First Emily, now Mom. It's like the world just wants to take everything away." Miller sat down across from him. "Life has been unfair to you, Jackson. There's no denying that. But you're not alone anymore. We'll fight this together." Jackson looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "How? What can we even do?" "We start by getting a lawyer for your mom," Miller said. "I know someone who can help. But first, I need to get you somewhere safe for tonight." "I don't want to leave," Jackson said stubbornly. "What if Mom comes back? What if Emily needs me?" Miller sighed. "I understand, but right now you need a stable place to stay. And don't worry, I'll be here every step of the way." Miller drove Jackson to a local family shelter, one he knew had resources for situations like this. The staff were kind, offering Jackson a warm meal and a bed. Still, the boy's eyes were clouded with worry. "Try to get some rest," Miller said as he tucked a blanket around Jackson. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps." Jackson didn't reply. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The next morning, Miller met with a local attorney, Miss Sarah Connolly, who had a reputation for helping low-income families. When Miller explained the situation, Sarah agreed to take on the case pro bono. "I'll file a motion to have her released while we investigate," Sarah said confidently. "From what you've told me, this sounds like a misunderstanding or worse, a setup." "Thank you, Sarah," Miller said, relief washing over him. But as he left her office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the school secretary. "Urgent. You need to get to the school now. Something's happened." When Miller arrived at Greenfield Middle School, the scene was chaotic. Students were gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing toward the schoolyard. "What's going on?" Miller asked the secretary, who looked pale and shaken. "It's Jackson," she said. "He left the shelter early this morning and came here. He's refusing to come inside. He's sitting in the schoolyard, and, well, you should see for yourself." Miller rushed outside and found Jackson sitting under a tree, clutching his backpack. His face was tear-streaked, and his clothes were covered in dirt. "Jackson," Miller said gently, crouching beside him. "What are you doing here?" Jackson looked up, his expression defiant. "I didn't want to stay at that shelter. I don't need anyone's pity. I just want things to go back to how they were." Miller sighed, his heart aching for the boy. "I know you're hurting, Jackson, but running away won't fix anything." "I'm not running away," Jackson said firmly. "I'm staying here. This school is the only place that feels normal anymore." Miller nodded slowly. "Okay, but if you're going to be here, let me help you. We can't do this alone." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." As the days passed, Miller worked tirelessly to piece Jackson's family back together. He coordinated with social workers to expedite Emily's return home and gathered evidence to clear Jackson's mother of the theft charges. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. But just when things seemed to be turning around, a new obstacle arose. Sarah Connolly called Miller late one evening, her voice tense. "We've hit a snag," she said. "The diner owner is adamant that Jackson's mother stole from him. He claims to have video evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Miller asked, dread creeping in. "I haven't seen it yet, but he's refusing to hand it over unless we meet his demands," Sarah said. "What demands?" "He wants the charges dropped in exchange for her resigning from the diner," Sarah explained. "He says he doesn't want someone with a questionable reputation working for him." Miller gritted his teeth. "This is blackmail. He's trying to ruin her life." "I know," Sarah said, "but unless we can disprove his claims, she might not have a choice." Miller hung up and stared out the window, his mind racing. The diner owner's accusations were flimsy at best, but they were enough to keep Jackson's family in turmoil. He knew they were running out of time, but just as he was about to call Sarah back, his phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. "I have proof the diner owner is lying. Meet me at the park at 10 p.m. Principal Miller stared at the text message, his pulse quickening. Who could have sent this? And why meet in the park at such a late hour? The message smelled of danger, but if there was even a shred of truth in it, he couldn't ignore it. He texted back, "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "A friend, just come alone." Miller hesitated but ultimately grabbed his coat and headed out. He couldn't afford to miss an opportunity to clear Jackson's mother's name, no matter how risky it seemed. The park was eerily quiet when Miller arrived, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows over the playground. He glanced around, his breath visible in the crisp night air. A figure emerged from the darkness, a hood pulled tightly over their head. "You came?" the person said in a low voice. "Who are you?" Miller demanded, "And what proof do you have?" The figure pulled out a flash drive and held it out. "This," they said, "is a copy of the diner's security footage. It shows everything, including how the owner staged the theft." Miller's eyebrows shot up. "Why are you helping?" The figure hesitated, then pushed back their hood. It was a teenage boy, no older than 17. "My dad is the owner," he admitted. "He's been stealing from the register for months and blaming it on the staff. I overheard him talking about framing Jackson's mom, and I couldn't stay silent." Miller stared at the boy, torn between shock and admiration. "You did the right thing," he said, "but you need to come forward with this." The boy shook his head. "I can't. If my dad finds out I helped, he'll kick me out. Just use this to help her." Miller took the flash drive and nodded. "Thank you. You've done something great tonight." The boy turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Miller standing alone. The next morning, Miller met with Sarah Connolly, his hand shaking as he handed over the flash drive. "This could be it," he said. "The proof we need." Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop and watched the footage. The video clearly showed the diner owner pocketing money from the register and later planting evidence to implicate Jackson's mother. "This is gold," Sarah said, her voice triumphant. "We can take this straight to the police and have her cleared." By midday, the news had spread. The charges against Jackson's mother were dropped, and the diner owner was facing his own legal trouble. When Jackson's mother returned home that evening, Jackson ran to her, throwing his arms around her. "Mom," he cried, his voice filled with relief. "I knew you didn't do it." She held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm sorry for everything." Principal Miller watched the reunion from the doorway, his heart swelling with pride and relief. But there was still one more battle to fight, bringing Emily back home. With the support of the community, Miller worked to present a compelling case to child services. Letters poured in from teachers, neighbors, and even Jackson's classmates, all testifying to the family's resilience and determination. Finally, after weeks of uncertainty, the day came. Jackson and his mother stood outside the family court building, waiting for the final decision. Miller stood beside them, offering quiet encouragement. When the caseworker emerged, her face was kind but unreadable. "The judge has decided to reunite your family," she said with a smile. "Emily can come home." Jackson let out a whoop of joy, and his mother broke down in grateful sobs. Miller placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder, his own eyes misting over. That evening, the family was whole again. Emily ran into Jackson's arms the moment she walked through the door, her laughter filling the tiny house. For the first time in months, hope and happiness felt tangible. Miller stayed for a while, sharing a simple meal with the family. As he prepared to leave, Jackson pulled him aside. Thank you, Jackson said, his voice steady. For everything. Miller knelt to meet the boy's gaze. You don't need to thank me, Jackson. You taught me more about strength and courage than I ever thought possible. Jackson smiled, his face glowing with a sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, the weight on his young shoulders felt lighter. As Miller drove home that night, he reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been long and filled with hardships, but it had also brought out the best in everyone involved. And as he looked up at the stars twinkling in the night sky, he couldn't help but feel that brighter days were ahead for Jackson and his family. The boy who had once walked miles to school, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, now had a village behind him, and a future filled with possibility.